Okay. I want to thank all of y'all for signing on and for doing this. I recognize that for some of you, this is probably one of many Zoom meetings. So I recognize there's some fatigue with that. And then I recognize for other of you, this has been a long day. So thank you for all participating. I wanted to briefly comment about what we're doing tonight. And I thought the best way to do that was to talk about how the name that we chose for this forum is in Richmond as it is in heaven. And the reason for that is because one, it's catchy and we're all about that digital engagement. But also the other reason that we chose that name was because in Richmond as it is in heaven is illustrative of the eschatological underpinning of the ethical life of the church. And here's what I mean by that, put very simply. This world that we live in right now isn't just something that's going to burn up at the end of the age. We're going to say, okay, done with that old thing. But rather, what the Bible teaches is that God has redeemed in Jesus and the cross. He's redeeming through the work of the church, and he's going to definitively redeem when he comes again. And so what that means is that in this already not yet time in which we live, the life of the church is to be one that is a signpost of the kingdom that is to come. So we live now on earth as it is in heaven, as Jesus taught us to pray. And what that means is that the world that is to come is one that has God at its center and is defined by his perfections, his attributes, one of which is his perfect justness. And so what that means is that the church should always be about and concerned with justice, not because it's something that is trending or not because it's something that is the thing to talk about, but rather it's evergreen for the church, because the church are people who are supposed to do what? To point towards the world that is to come. And so that's what we're doing tonight. We are talking about what does it look like for us to begin to reflect upon the issues that have been of racial injustice that have been highlighted through the ongoing protest. And then what does it look like for us to begin to engage? And I recognize, let me put this out front, that for some of you, this forum is not, it's going to just say things that you already knew, and that's totally fine. For some of you, this forum may say too much. For some, it may not say enough. What we're simply doing in this is we're wanting to provide an entry point into those two things. Introspection about how am I as a Christian, as a signpost to the coming King, how am I implicated in the work that people are being asked to do right now? And then how do I begin to engage in that? So the way in which we're going to do that is we're going to have a couple of people present. And these are all people from within the church. And we decided that we wanted to do that rather than invite in someone who's an expert on this, because we have people in the church who are very knowledgeable and have of all these issues and are going to be great at helping us to start to think about these things. So we're going to have Ross Catrow is going to start us off, and then Kathryn Parkhurst, and then Mark Kronenthal, and then Eric is going to end with a kind of a pastoral charge. So I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to Ross.
Hello. No one can say hello back, but hello. So tonight, to provide context for the rest of the night, I thought I would talk a little bit about the stuff I've been learning about becoming anti-racist. So I have I have 4 good steps, and I'll talk about where they came from in a minute, but I think it'll provide good context for racism in Richmond, how that applies to monuments like we have outside of our church, but also how that applies to systemic issues like housing, schools, police. Literally every issue that we have in the city and in America most likely has a racial component. And I think beginning to talk about how we can become actively against racism is a good place to start, about how to actively get involved and work against some of these systemic issues. So step number one, Harrison was like, blah, 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 experts. I am not an expert. I am a white man who is busy working through his own racism constantly. So most of this stuff is resources from other people that are smarter and have more lived experience than I do. And I hope to just share it with you and hope that, you know, you can start being introspective about this stuff too. So Ross is not an expert at all. And then these 4 points, which I'm going to share hopefully quickly, and then maybe we can do Q&As. Harrison, can we do Q&As? Is that okay? Q&As. Come from the Anti-Racism Starter Kit, which is at wherechangestarted.com by a woman named L. Glenise Pike. So she has a freely available PDF you can get and read more about this stuff. But I think these are 4 good steps that are like practical and easy to do to like get started and continue thinking about this kind of stuff. I'm gonna keep going. Harrison, good? Okay, cool. Step number 1 in the anti-racism toolkit or starter kit is awareness. And I'm just gonna quote from her real quick. It is the moment you find yourself awakened to the fact that not only does the problem exist, but that you are a crucial part of it. You acknowledge that you can no longer be a bystander in the fight dismantling white supremacy. If you're reading this guide, you're likely ready for stage 2. So some of us might be in stage 1 where we're just coming to awareness that racism permeates our society, our city of Richmond, in a lot of very visible ways like monuments, and a lot of very subtle ways like zoning, which if anyone wants to ask questions about zoning later, let's do it. For me, my moment of kind of awakening to my role in white supremacy was the shooting in Charleston a couple of years back at the Emmanuel African Methodist Episcopal Church. I think we all remember that. And then a couple of days after that, a woman named Bree Newsom, a Black woman, scaled the flagpole outside of the South Carolina State Legislature and pulled down the Confederate battle flag, which is wild to think about. At the time, out front of the South Carolina State House, they just had a Confederate flag flying. Like that was regular and fine. So she scaled that and pulled it down. And it really got me thinking about how am I talking about and thinking about the Confederacy living in Richmond, racism living in Richmond. At the time, I used to run a news site called RVA News, and we would regularly post like beautiful pictures of all of our Confederate monuments. And we had never like thought about what do those monuments mean. Like they were cool, picturesque photos of beautiful landscapes in our city. But for a lot of folks, they represent horrible, horrible things. And we had just never considered it. So for us, for me, at that moment, that was like, oh, there's a bigger game at foot, which obviously is a very privileged position to have, right? Where you're like, oh wait, racism is real. Like it took me until I was 30 to figure that out. So I'm a slow learner. So maybe y'all are already past stage 1. I want to do real quick next steps too. Stage 1, if you're in stage 1, next steps are join this call, cool, check it off, and maybe read through the anti-racism starter kit, which we'll send a link out or you can go look it up. Stage 2 is education. The education stage of anti-racism is where you become a student and begin to study history, present-day manifestations of racism, and the terms and concepts that go with them. So for me, I'm on Twitter a lot. I'm very on Twitter, and it was following Black and brown folks. That was the best way that I have become educated about this. Just listening to people who have a different lived experience than I do, talk about racism, or just talk about everyday life and be like, wait a second. My experience at night driving home is not the same as their experience at night driving home. I don't really drive home, I ride a bike home, but you know, you get the idea. So let's see, next steps for, if you're in the education side of things, next steps, follow more Black and brown people on your social media of choice. Find an anti-racist reading list. There's a lot of those floating around. I would look for one by a Black or brown person and read some of those things. And then another great one, just a specific one, is The Color of Law, which is an excellent book about redlining. And I think part of my education of how racism permeates everything is about redlining. A lot of our problems come from redlining today, and you should read this book called Color of Law. It'll explain it all. We can talk about redlining too after this if you want. Step 3, this is the hardest step. This is self-interrogation. In this stage, you start identifying, unpacking, dismantling the ways in which your past and present behaviors are perpetuating white supremacy. This is hard because you've like realized there's a problem, you've learned what the problem is, and now you're at the point where you are like, wait a second, I have to change some of my behaviors, or I am still part of the problem. For us, and this is just for the Catrows, a lot of this was thinking about public school. We had never once given a thought to sending our son to his zoned public middle school, ever. And we had to have lots of conversations about why had we never even thought about it. It just was totally off the table for us at the time. And I think the reason we had never even considered it is because of white supremacy and the way that plays itself into schools, and then played itself into our awareness of how schools work. So that was a hard conversation for our family to have. And that's not the same for every family, but that's one way in which we had to like really self-interrogate what we were doing and what we thought was right. And again, this is the hardest thing. And the next steps for this would be like, think about how things make you feel. Like, how does affordable housing make you feel? How do taxes make you feel? How does public school make you feel? How does the disparity in the impact of COVID-19 between Black and brown people and white people make you feel? Like, what are the feelings you have when you hear about those things? And then like meta layer, why are you having those feelings? And you can see how these steps build on each other, because if you haven't done the education part, you probably don't know enough to know why you're feeling those feelings that you're having. And then the fourth final step is community action. And this is basically sharing and convincing other white people to do the work that you've done. And I think she says this is a really great point. This stage is the most anticipated stage of the process. People of action like to act. It's understandable. Unfortunately for this stage, it is also the one where you can cause the most amount of harm if you've attempted to bypass thoroughly engaging with the previous three steps. This is super duper true. You don't want to be the white person who comes in knowing all the stuff when you don't know anything at all. There's lots of people that know more than you. There's lots of people with lived experience that have way more information than you do. And I have screwed this up 100,000 times. My job is a transit advocate. I do public transit advocacy, and a lot of that is advocacy for folks with lower incomes, Black and brown folks. And early when I started doing this, I would often be the white guy in the room who thought he knew best for the Black and brown people who knew way more than me. And so I've learned a lot about how not to jump to the community action stage, but to do the work beforehand. And so if you get to stage 4, the next steps for that are just talk to your friends and family about anti-racism, and then maybe send some people the links and the education stuff that you found earlier on. Spread that stuff around. There's a lot of talking. I want to read 2 more things. Do I have time to read 2 more things, Harrison? Okay. Do you guys listen to the Good Morning City Church podcast? It's pretty cool. I don't know if y'all listen to this. Julie Davis put together one on June 10th. And I'm just going to quote Julie Davis because she's smarter than I am. And I think this puts it really well. She says, "Scripture shows us that we have a God whose heart is broken by injustice, who actively responds to it and calls us to do the same. We know that it was after his own image that God created Ahmaud Arbery, George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, David McCaddy, and so many others whose precious blood was spilled. City Church, when this battle against injustice feels too big, remember that it is not ours alone. We must respond, but we don't do it single-handedly. The violence and oppression against our fellow Black and brown image bearers is deeply grievous to our God. He sees, he hears, and he acts." I just think that's really great because it does feel overwhelming a lot of the time. But like Julie said, we're not in it alone, which I think is really comforting. And then I want to just end with, do you guys know Valerie Catrow? I don't know if anyone knows Val, but we were talking about this. And I feel like this is what happens at City Church a lot is like people listen to Val. I'm biased, right, obviously, but like Val says some stuff and then we incorporate it into the things that we get to tell other people. So Val said, we confess our sins every week as a church body, and we need to do the work of anti-racism every week as well. It's an ongoing work. So when we think about this stuff, it's not like you suddenly become not a racist. It's ongoing anti-racism work, which was Valerie's point. That was a lot of talking. You guys, you didn't even have a chance to interrupt. So thanks.
All right, thanks so much, Ross. Okay, let's take a couple of moments for a couple of questions. So if you have a question, just simply unmute yourself and ask.
We can talk about zoning too.
Hey, Ross. Can you tell me a little bit about zoning?
Zoning's so cool, man. Here's how racism applies to zoning, is that we've done a lot of work in making our best, most beautiful, wonderful places to live, places where very few people can live. So they're like supply and demand, right? They're very super expensive. And that's what zoning does. It says, what can you build on a piece of land? And our zoning code has decided that the best places are for the most wealthy and the fewest and the whitest among us. And so we live in a city where if you can't afford a big, beautiful house, you probably live in a less desirable neighborhood. And I'm not even speaking like crime or whatever, but like less desirable in like, it's not next to cool stuff. It's next to a highway. It's built on top of an old garbage dump. Those are all actual things that happen in Richmond. So like, we're going through a rezoning process right now in the city of Richmond. They're rezoning the area around the Science Museum. And there will be pushback to limit the number of folks that can live back behind the Science Museum. But the truth is, we need more places for people to live so that places can be more affordable, so that more people can take advantage of all the cool amenities we have, and not just the affluent white people. So zoning's cool, but it also is very uncool.
All right. Any more questions? I'm good at awkward pauses, so, or maybe I'm not by saying that.
Eric's good at awkward pauses. Eric will sit you there forever.
Hey, Ross, can you talk about redlining?
Yeah, so
you said it 3 times, but you didn't actually define it.
Yeah, I want you to read the book. Go get the book. So redlining was like many years ago. It was like 30s, 40s, 50s. The government gave very good loans to certain people, mostly white people. And the term redlining comes from, they would grade these neighborhoods and on a map and like draw squares around which were the most desirable neighborhoods and which neighborhoods were least desirable. And like, if you go and look at these forms of how they graded neighborhoods, the literal field on the form is Negroes, yes or no. And if you have a yes, then your neighborhood is less desirable. And so less loans were given to folks trying to build in those neighborhoods, less money to do repairs and stuff. So over time, those neighborhoods have just become disinvested in. And if you look at the redlining map, Blake knows way more about this than me. So like Blake should be talking about this. But if you look at the redlining map of Richmond, and then you look at maps today of like air quality, is worse in a red line neighborhood. If you look at life expectancy, it's worse. If you look at literally any health outcome is worse in a red line. And this was like almost 100 years ago, right? The federal government made these decisions to redline these neighborhoods. And the impacts today you see in literally everything, income, like every single thing in these certain neighborhoods is worse because of this systemic disinvestment in neighborhoods that were literally, because Black people lived there, the federal government didn't want to invest there. Color of Law is the name of that book, and it's Richard something, Shel Silverstein.
Well, Ross, I don't think you can just say it was 100 years ago. The first house that Stan and I bought had covenants in the deeds that made it illegal to sell the house to Black people, to Negroes, and Jews, by the way. But you know, that was going on certainly in my lifetime.
One of the things that really made this hit home for me too was in reading about how the creation of those FHA loans essentially made the middle class in America. You know, there were other factors too, but in large part, it made it possible for there to be a middle class in America, where before it was such a huge dichotomy between the rich and the poor, and only white people had access to that step up, or largely white people.
Yeah, it's an extreme government subsidization of that middle class at that time that wasn't available elsewhere.
Okay.
Hey Ross, this is Eric. I don't have my video on, but I have a question for you. In that list of steps to be an anti-racist, they all feel pretty individual. How can you take those steps in a community of others?
Yeah, what a great city church vibe question. I think like awareness is good to do with one another, right? Like if we're a safe community of friends and family, like it is safer to be with one another and say, hey, like, I don't understand this. Why are people upset about this? Or can you explain to me what people are upset about this thing? So I think we can share awareness and provoke awareness in like a kind way with others. But I think education is like the real community building aspect. Like we could read books together, we could read articles together, we could do like studies, we could, you know, I don't know, we can make podcasts together or whatever else it is that PCA people do together. But I think we could share that knowledge and discussion and kind of pull us along. Like Val said, like the work is continual. So I think there's always new stuff that we could be learning as a community to kind of help us build those skills. So when we have to self-interrogate about a new thing, like what is the next thing? Like, have we thought about police? I have never thought about police reform ever in my life. And so like, this is a new moment for me to self-interrogate and to learn. And we can be doing that as a community, I think. So I think there's a lot of opportunity in that second stage.
All right, well, Ross, thank you so much. We really appreciate that. We're going to move on now to Kathryn Parkhurst. Kathryn, if you would, please give us a brief introduction and then go ahead and kick off.
All right, thanks, Harrison. Hi, everyone. I'm Kathryn Parkhurst. I have been a high school history teacher for almost 10 years. I took a break to get my master's in history at VCU, and I never anticipated that I would study the history of housing and write like 100 pages on the history of housing in Richmond. But what I found with housing is that it kind of explained a lot of the systemic racism that I knew existed. It explained how that came to be. I'll cover some things that Ross talked about as well with redlining. Thank you to some of the people who are here today who I got to interview for my thesis and helped me so much. But housing, I also didn't realize until I started looking into housing how much housing and education are intertwined and why we have segregated schools still. So I am kind of going to cover a brief history of housing in Richmond. I hope this will be helpful for us all to kind of have some of that background knowledge to better understand the neighborhoods that we live in. I was asked specifically to speak about gentrification. It's probably a term you've heard a lot. When we look at the city of Richmond, Churchill is the best example of a gentrified neighborhood, but we could go case by case in the Q&A if you want to talk about other neighborhoods. But the term gentrification was first used in the 1960s to describe a London neighborhood where working class residents were pushed out because upper middle class residents moved in and basically rehabbed homes and turned them into really luxurious homes. And so the older definition is sort of residents have been displaced. I would say the more working definition today that people are thinking of when they use the term gentrification is basically white people are moving into a neighborhood that has been predominantly a minority neighborhood, and they're changing that culture of the neighborhood. So not so much the forced displacement that we'll talk about. There are unfortunately a couple examples in Richmond of forced displacement, but there is always the lingering pressure of displacement. Longtime residents could see the neighborhood changing, property taxes going up, and they could say to themselves, well, I might as well just get out. So there is sort of the pressure of displacement. And gentrification is a term that has a negative connotation, but scholars would say there are pros and cons, right? It's very complicated. So some historians would say this has been going on since the Roman Empire. It just always will be. Gentrification will always happen. If we didn't have gentrification, our cities would just have a monoculture of poverty. And that is essentially, Richmond City was essentially a city that was a monoculture of poverty for much of the 1960s, 70s, 80s, 90s. And so it also, gentrification is super appealing for local governments because they don't have to do the legwork of raising a ton of capital for new projects. It's just kind of happening for them. But of course, scholars talk about costs, gentrifying neighborhoods, displacement, but more so the loss of culture, the loss of social norms, longtime residents feeling like they can't do things like hang out on street corners, play loud music, that amenities that they used to be able to have, like getting shoes repaired, that's gone, but I can buy a $6 latte, right? So the amenities change in a neighborhood to suit a white middle class. So that's just a quick overview of gentrification. But I want to go to the 1950s real quick because that is the transformative decade when it comes to housing. You kind of have two parallel tracks that are ensuing. On one hand, you have the federal government's blessing to begin urban renewal in cities. And that sounds like a beautiful term, urban renewal. But in fact, what that meant was you can tear down anything that is a slum. And I'll give you one guess, the neighborhoods that were deemed slums. So African-American neighborhoods in cities in the 1950s are being torn down left and right. Then you have President Eisenhower come out with the Interstate Highway Act. Highways are getting built through cities. And where did all the white people go? They're going to the suburbs, which, as Ross mentioned, the government is basically subsidizing that whole process. The government is backing FHA loans. White Americans are given these loans, and then they are able to conveniently use the highways that the government has built to get to their jobs in the cities and then return. If anyone is an avid I Love Lucy watcher, I Love Lucy sums it up perfectly. The first 5 seasons, she's living in a tiny apartment in Manhattan. In the last season, she's in a farm in Connecticut. So that is the experience of white Americans. And as Stefan said, this was something that previously was unattainable to purchase a home. But starting in the government got it going in the 1930s, but really by the 1950s, especially with the GI Bill, this was now attainable for white middle-class Americans. The Federal Housing Authority only gave loans for single-family homes. They didn't give loans for multi-family homes. So right there, that was another way that African Americans were pushed out. The GI Bill, veterans had to go through banks, private banks, to get loans. So virtually no African American veterans were able to benefit from the GI Bill. There's one scholar who interviewed an African American couple who went to 61 banks looking for a GI Bill loan and finally got one after 61 banks. So in Richmond, we see a couple examples of urban renewal and slum clearance. Jackson Ward was known as the Harlem of the South. It was a thriving African-American neighborhood. Highways were built through it. Homes were destroyed to make way for eventually the Richmond Coliseum, the Convention Center. Fulton neighborhood, I don't know how many people are aware of this, but kind of in the Rockets Landing, if you can picture Stone Brewery and Triple Crossing Brewery. A total of the estimate is 850 homes, churches, businesses completely destroyed. It was deemed a slum starting in the 1960s. That's how the city kept describing it. This is a slum neighborhood. We need to tear it down. That is forced displacement. 850 businesses and homes were destroyed, and nothing was put in its place for decades. So that is obviously a very sore point for many Richmonders, that nothing was even built to replace it. It was just torn down. So the Churchill was another predominantly African-American neighborhood in the 1950s. And as Ross talked about with redlining, neighborhoods are ranked A to D. And like, for example, in Richmond, Windsor Farms, Tuckahoe, these West End neighborhoods, they just were listed as best people, green. Churchill, for example, was listed as red, letter D, and they said that infiltration of Negroes with a population of 80% Negro and increasing. So no African American in Churchill is going to be able to buy a home. So you have a captive rental market. So you can imagine powerlessness that tenants felt. A study was done in the 1960s that the majority of homes in Churchill still did not have indoor plumbing. Homes were falling apart. A third grade class from George Mason Elementary wrote a letter to city council, like basically begging them to clean up the homes surrounding the school so that they felt safe going out and playing. So you have this captive rental market who is powerless, and then you have inefficient, uncaring landlords. And so this cycle produces itself where then the government feels warranted to tear down homes and displace residents. But what's interesting about Churchill is that it doesn't get torn down like Fulton did or like Jackson Ward. And so in the 1950s, one resident who was interviewed said, anyone who was white was out of Churchill by the 1950s. Any African American who was middle class was out by the 1970s. So why wasn't, and that's just a side note, middle class African Americans also participate in gentrification, and there isn't as much scholarship on that, which is something that needs to be looked into more. But anyway, so why wasn't Churchill destroyed in the same way that Fulton and Jackson Ward were? And that is, there's a very specific story behind that. The Historic Richmond Foundation was a group of white middle-class Richmonders who in 1956, before the term gentrification had even formed, they ensued gentrification in Churchill. So they decided that St. John's Church, which is the location where Patrick Henry gave his famous "Give me liberty or give me death" speech, they needed to save the neighborhood around St. John's Church, that this iconic moment in American history needs to be preserved. They also cited that it was here in Churchill, you could hear the echoes of Civil War battles where the Confederates fought. So there was a lot of historical ties to the Patriots of the Revolutionary War, the Confederates of the Civil War, and so the neighborhood had to be preserved. And what's interesting is we have a collection of letters or correspondences between the members of the Historic Richmond Foundation in which they blatantly come up with strategies for forced displacement. So they wrote to landlords saying, "We will pay you to board up your home and get rid of the Black tenants until we can find white tenants." There was a rumor that a Black dance hall was coming into a business across from St. John's Church. So those businesses were torn down. And that is where Patrick Henry Park stands. So if you've ever hung out in Patrick Henry Park, maybe eating proper pie and looking over at St. John's Church, that was designed to make sure that there were no Black-owned businesses standing across from St. John's Church. If any tenants wanted to buy a home from the Historic Richmond Foundation, they had to sit down with a board, with board members, and get approved, which I interviewed one woman who that is the process her and her husband went through. And she said, they wanted to make sure it was just the right kind of people who lived in their homes. So the Historic Richmond Foundation worked really hard to basically create this white enclave, and that group that started just around St. John's Church spread to the Libby Hill Park area and basically planted the seeds of gentrification that, as we know, have grown quite a bit. And then they were hoping businesses would follow. That's kind of the marriage of gentrification. You have a higher, like a middle class group coming in, but businesses then follow, which then attract further development. So they were hoping to create like a future, like another Georgetown or Charleston, but it just didn't happen in the 60s and 70s. In fact, in 1994, Governor Allen had state troopers in Churchill because the murder rate was so high. So the rest of the neighborhood really went through some serious decline, but then within the last 5 to 10 years, as new businesses have opened, we're seeing Churchill reach its full gentrification today. So I was asked to think of, implications and practical applications. As a historian and someone who loves history, we really like to stay in the past. The present is not a comfortable place, but some implications to think about would be, we do not live in an integrated world. And the question, it's kind of like the chicken and egg discussion. What will cause integration first, housing or education? And of course, when Brown versus Board of Education was passed in 1954, the same time as white flight to suburbs, that was seen as, okay, this is our chance to integrate. And I could go down a whole education rabbit trail. Of course, gentrification, or of course, integration did not happen. The next kind of major attempt will be in the 1970s with busing for integration, and the country just said, no, we're not doing busing. Your school is tied to your neighborhood. So we have segregated housing, so then we have segregated schools. And now people who are interested in integrating schools are saying, well, I guess it's not going to be schools first. It's going to be our neighborhoods. And so with a neighborhood like Churchill, we're close to integration. You have two sides that are next to each other. So it's thinking about, well, how do we get fully integrated, right? Scholars have commented that gentrification means it's diversity on white people's terms. Like when white people are comfortable with diversity, that is kind of the essence of gentrification. So I loved hearing Ross talk about, sending their son to a public middle school, right? That is something that gentrification is happening more with younger people. In the 60s and 70s, when the term was first used, it was retirees coming back into the city. They didn't have school-aged kids. What we see now is that gentrification is happening amongst young families. So the question is, what will happen with school-aged kids? I don't know if you guys have seen what's been floating around on social media, which is, and I won't say it exactly right, but basically, I'm excited to see everyone who's out protesting signing their children up for the local neighborhood school tomorrow. So I think, as we consider the protests and our participation in them, that's going to be one way in which people will, people are interested to see, how do we handle education and integration? Patrick Henry, the thing that saved the neighborhood of Churchill from total destruction, essentially, was Patrick Henry's speech, "Give me liberty or give me death." He wasn't talking about freedom for everyone, right? He had a very exclusive view of who freedom was meant for. I don't know if this is true or not, but the folklore is that he had actually locked his wife in the basement for being mouthy before he went to make the speech. So he had a very, very small view of who freedom was for. The Historic Richmond Foundation wanted to preserve the neighborhood of Churchill for a very specific group of people. So one of the biggest implications I can think of is, down the road, if City Church considers buying a building, the neighborhood that will be selected, and then as church members, that we would be sensitive to, has this neighborhood experienced gentrification? How can we have a vision of inclusion, since basically the story of housing, the history of housing, is one of exclusion? And that's it.
All right, Kathryn, thank you so much. Thank you especially for bringing back up the city church buying a building. Evergreen topic. Okay, let's take some time for Q&A. So again, if you have a question, unmute yourself.
Kathryn, did any of your research touch on the impact of injections of generational wealth into the retreating Black middle class from some of these neighborhoods?
No, I didn't. I personally didn't come across a lot of research in general about the Black middle class.
Kathryn, I have a question for you. I'm curious if you could speak to the gentrification of small and local businesses and what it means for a community like us to continue to support them and participate in the life of our city through minority-owned businesses or Black and brown business owners.
So business owners, similarly to residents, experience gentrification in the same way, right? If the middle class white residents who are coming into a neighborhood are not going to frequent those businesses, they're going to close. I think another critical piece is advocacy. So the fact that, which a lot of people have talked about, the fact that Churchill is a food desert. So you have, these 5-star restaurants like the Roosevelt and Dutch and Company, but there's no grocery store. There's no access to, particularly in Churchill North, right? There's not access to fresh produce. So I think for businesses, it's both frequenting them, but also paying attention to, if I didn't have a car, what would be my options? And then considering a place of advocacy to bring in those businesses that are needed, because 30 years ago, 20 years ago, some of those businesses may have been there, right? That's one of the things that the Fulton neighborhood, they had grocery stores, right? And then everything's torn down and there still isn't a grocery store in that area. And so, yeah, I think advocacy from a position of power is really important to keep in mind.
Hey, this is Eric again. I wonder if Andrew or Liz, if you guys could share a little bit about the work you've done up in Churchill North and how that might relate to this conversation around gentrification of that neighborhood.
Sure thing. Thanks, Kathryn, for doing such a good job of storytelling for Fulton and Churchill. Storied past for both of these neighborhoods. One of the questions I was going to ask you in particular was, how do we get these neighborhoods back to a place where they are flourishing? Where we do have a sustainable economy, where we would see a more just way of living for these communities. And one of the ways that that we have seen that occur, Liz and I, through the work we do at Site Design, is through a project called Churchill North, which is on the very northern reaches of what some would not consider Churchill, but almost out toward the interstate near Creighton Court. That property backs up to a cemetery and was historically the location of Armstrong High School. That building was raised several years ago with the understanding that property would be developed as a mixed income housing community. And you can see the first phase of that now. Some beautiful homes have been built there, some for rent, some for sale. A new community center has been built there with a playground. And it's one of those projects that we need more of in the city of Richmond to offer affordable housing opportunities for all people, but also a way to begin to unfold some of the concentrated poverty that exist in some of these in some of these neighborhoods, but also in the housing projects that we have in our city as well. But as an example, what are some other ways that we would see these neighborhoods get to a place where they do have the economics to support grocery stores and then begin to flourish and recreate some of the culture that may have been displaced?
So that's a great question. That is really what everyone's wondering. The only thing I can really speak to is that in the 1960s, well, I want to back up just a little bit. I think the language we use is also so important. The Historic Richmond Foundation started this campaign to only talk about church. They wanted Church Hill only to be used for the 2 blocks that they were renovating. And they said, for those of you who live in Church Hill, you may find this comical. There was a crime that occurred at 22nd Street and Venable, right there. And they were like, that might as well have been Monument Avenue. You should never, they wrote to the Times Dispatch, you should absolutely not have called that Church Hill. And so even the language we are using tonight, which I'm using as well, Church Hill North, Church Hill, right? We use these terms to differentiate in our minds the who is living where, right? But anyway, in the 1960s, the city of Richmond applied for this huge grant from the federal government. They got $10 million to basically rehab Church Hill North. And they were trying to compete with the Historic Richmond Foundation and to, say okay, you're doing this for the white part of the neighborhood. We can do this for the black part of the neighborhood. And the conclusion they came to was the $10 million disappeared. They absolutely accomplished nothing. It was a tremendous failure. And the thing they walked away from, in the report, is we couldn't get enough people in their own home. We've got to have people, we've got to be able to put these residents, they need to be able to own their own home. That's the difference between what we did and what the Historic Richmond Foundation did. They got people in homes that they owned. So that's just what comes to mind. There are organizations in Richmond like the Better Housing Coalition that are doing incredible things to help people actually own homes who are at a lower income. And so I think supporting organizations like that, there is something, because I read so many newspaper articles of Church Hill residents, in the 60s and 70s saying, we want to feel dignity too. We want to be proud of our home too. But I come home to a house that someone else owns that they won't take care of, and there's nothing I can do.
I just wanted to thank you, Kathryn, for sharing all that. I wanted to jump on to something Andrew was talking about for Church Hill North. The second phase of the Church Hill North project is supposed to be commercial space on 9 Mile Road, which is supposed to be subsidized, hopefully to allow minority businesses to come in. And it's stuff like that, creating incentives and avenues for minorities to start businesses, to bring businesses back to those areas. That's really important. And I think another project that Andrew and I worked on in a different part of the city, but in historic Fulton, was a memorial project to the neighborhood that got torn down as part of urban renewal. So that project, which we're still trying to get funding and build, that's another story. But that project, what we were working with community organizers, and especially one man who'd been part of the Black Panthers and had been advocating for years to get historic Fulton the investment that it deserved and for people to remember what happened there. So part of the job that people in design communities can do is work on those projects that help people to remember the history of those places, the good and the bad, that culture wouldn't be forgotten. And jumping back, sorry, to Churchill North, Kathryn and I went to a community meeting about Churchill North years ago before they started building it. And one of the things that the residents said is, without the second phase, without the commercial, without the incentivizing and subsidizing of commercial spaces, you're really just moving us from Creighton to nicer housing. We still don't have access to jobs or public transportation. So this is where things like Ross's job and like there are so many facets in rebuilding these neighborhoods. It's not just housing, although some of the things that Andrew and I are privileged to work on are an important component, but that without access to jobs and subsidies for minority businesses and transportation, that these communities will never get to the level of vibrancy that they once had. So.
All right.
One thing to add on is it's a little confusing. Our project up there is called Churchill North, even though it is also an adopted name that's already used. But if you do get the opportunity to drive out 9 Mile and take a look at it, it's quite impressive. You would have no idea that it's a public-private partnership type project.
All right, great. Well, Kathryn, thank you so much. Really appreciate that. We're going to move on now to Mark Kronenthal. He's going to talk about things from the policy side. So, Mark, if you would, introduce yourself and feel free to get started.
Good evening, everyone. Thanks to everyone for hanging in there this evening. I'm Mark Kronenthal. I'm a former city official. I was the previous mayor of Richmond's, his last chief of staff. I was a senior policy advisor for strategic real estate matters, including several of the Churchill North projects. And I helped recruit the investor who has implemented the grocery store that does indeed exist at the corner of 9 Mile and 25th. I'm now in the private sector. I'm a zoning, local government, and commercial real estate attorney. A lot of my clients are affordable housing and multifamily housing developers. I'm the former chair of the Multifamily Housing Council. I'm a frequent advocate all across the region, and I've been fighting polite NIMBYism for perhaps 20 years now. And it's very interesting to watch social media where a lot of folks are advocating that we reject politeness. I don't know that I'm quite going there, but some folks on this that I'm looking at on the screen already know that I'll reject politeness from time to time. But I had some things that I wanted to share with you in terms of considerations that you want to, lenses that you want to put on, especially if you're a Christian who's going out and trying to be an effective advocate to actually implement, to work with your locality and the folks, your representatives your community in order to implement a lot of the things that folks are talking about right now. But I was really moved by one of the items that Ross said, and that was the Charleston shooting of the pastor down in Charleston, where a white man walked into a church and shot the pastor dead right there in front of everyone, a few other folks too. And that really was interesting to see Richmond's reaction to that. And a lot of folks like us, I had the benefit at the time of being friends with and knowing many senior Black pastors and representatives in the area. I think that was before my most recent stint in City Hall. But what those folks really noticed about the reaction of the white community here in Richmond was that the white community forgets that since 1972, the leadership of this city, the police in this city, the bureaucracy of this city, and every city agency and every state agency has been majority African American. So it's important that when you're advocating facing any kind of governmental entity, that you remember, especially in Richmond, you're not facing the white man. You know, whenever you're making those criticisms, you're facing a system, a local system, mind you, and not necessarily a social system, but it is largely a social system as well, that is led by African American professionals and folks who they were the first line in the battle for the civil rights in the 1960s. Actual folks sitting on city council were among the first African American model at Tallheimer's runway model is now currently on our city council, being denounced as a fascist by her competitor for her seat. Remarkable times that we're seeing now. So it's important whenever you're about to begin any kind of advocacy, it's important to challenge your own premise. You know, so is the person that you're about to stand in front of the person who are you fighting them? Are they the man? Are they the problem? You know, what is their role there? And that further was brought home by the last city council meeting. I don't know how many of you tuned in. I know at least one of you probably did. But a white male, demanded that the young African-American male mayor of the city of Richmond resign for being a racist. So again, I would encourage you, if you want your message to successfully get across, especially to the African-American folks that many of us are talking about wanting to be helpful to, again, challenge your premise. It's important to be an effective advocate to, we've talked a lot about some of the 101, redlining, all that stuff. If you're going to be an advocate in real estate and zoning, I mean, you've got to know that stuff rote. I mean, a lot of folks are just learning about it. You already have to have known about that. You know, that's, if you're standing up in front of a city council and you're talking about redlining, you're already, people are already going to be tuning you out. You can't give 101 to the folks who are your audience if you're going to be an advocate for the kind of change that's going to make a real difference for the folks. That's fine for all of us, among us chickens, to be talking about that. But if you're going up in front of the city council and you're going to start to talk about, some of the issues in Churchill North, but you don't know that the folks who saved the residential, the single family and small multifamily private residential areas of Churchill North from being demolished was Cedar Street Baptist Church, the largest Black congregation in the city of Richmond, marching on City Hall. You're gonna lose some points with the folks who are able to implement your changes, and you're gonna insult the African Americans who've been doing the work, while we've been in our other neighborhoods. So it is so important, and it's so important for all of us here on this call to know that the African Americans who've been doing the work are not on Twitter. They're not on Twitter. They're definitely not on Instagram. And they're definitely, they might be on Facebook, but their world is not in social media. You know, there's a lot of folks who want to get those votes in this season, and we need to remember that those are not the folks who've been elected by the communities that they claim to serve. So, you know, it's important for us, when folks who look like us, because a lot of us are starting to show up at city council, you know, with a lot of new demands, saying the word demand, you know, and not knowing, you know, the work that's been going on for hundreds of years. And that kind of brings me to, I guess, really the essence of what my comments have become. You know, as Christians, we're held to a different standard. And, you know, whenever, as a Christian, and whenever I sat, you know, I was not elected, but whenever I sat in, as a civil servant, you know, I observed Christians, you know, really believing full throttle, you know, in whatever they were coming to speak about. But there's one example I want to share, and I'm not going to name a name, but an advocate for the schools came to a budget hearing, and it was the budget had already been submitted. And so, as some folks who've been following the budgets for years, you know that once the budget has been introduced, if you're advocating for something, you're advocating for money to be taken away from something else. So if you're at a hearing where money is going to be allocated to something, it is being taken away in that moment from something else. So a Christian advocate, whom some of us know, got the money for the lawn mowing taken away and put towards school, which is a fine decision. That's what democracy is all about. But that same exact human, a few months later, appeared in a political campaign ad denouncing the city, for the African-American led city, for being incompetent and being unable to mow the lawn. So it's important for you to have consistency and integrity and be willing to accept rebuttal and accountability for the comments that you make in public whenever you're advocating for good things that do need change. You know, it's something that I have found in my own advocacy, and not just for clients, but for you know, a lot of the other efforts that I've done in terms of civic engagement. I learned whenever I first moved to Union Hill, which was a subpart of Churchill, my neighbors, my African-American neighbors, they remembered the day that the city came and cut down all the trees. You know, and they remember that, and I know Blake, you've come on a walk with me to see some of those trees a couple of years ago. And what my African-American neighbors said is that they really resented that, and they wanted trees back. You know, so that was somebody they specifically asked, you know, use your influence to get us trees back, and that's what we did. And so, you know, it's important to listen, because as we learn about atrocities and systemic atrocities, you know, over the years, you know, we're gonna grab on to something that we relate to. But it's really important to ask the folks who are your neighbors and are not just the folks that you're engaging with on social media. You need to ask them what they want. You know, because, you know, we are white saviors. We are secular white saviors if we take our own idea and we get in front of an audience and say that's what we're all going to do now. Whenever I was working on recruiting investors for the grocery store in Churchill North, you know, I remember going into a meeting with a lot of folks in the community, and I've told the story before, and I said, I'm here in a suit. I'm a white guy in a suit, and what I'm not going to do is tell you that we're all going to eat avocados now. You know, it's you gotta let it's not going to come out right. You know, you got to joke about it. That's my approach anyway. And then you've got to let folks who are doing the work and who know what those folks need, who can code switch without being offensive, you know, and talk and find out what the real needs are, if you want to accomplish what you're doing. And so the other issue is you need to balance whether is what you're feeling everybody needs to be able to have their reaction. You've got to let everybody have their reaction. Some really interesting things have been happening, in our society just in the last 2 weeks. And one of the things that I learned in government is that you let folks have their reaction. And once the reaction is gone, that's whenever you sit down and you get to work and you find out what is it that we can change to make things better. So, whenever we're in these moments of advocacy, it's great, that you can catch there are these periods, it's like anything else. There are periods where things are going to happen really fast, and that's exciting, but that momentum eventually stops. And then what are you going to change about those systems to make things better? And what are the real problems? And what's next? And that's where you need to find out is that, are you just trying to make a personal statement, to make sure everybody knows, what you are and who you are, or do you really want the system to change? Because, most of these folks in these neighborhoods, they aren't looking for your apology, that they really aren't. They have specific needs. Most of those needs, candidly, are a job or a chance. And what are the ways that we're going to help folks get those? I really appreciate there were some comments earlier about how it is, a whole system, and the housing, in the chicken or egg question, the housing is absolutely something that you're never going to get around. And I think that so long as there is public housing, which we can have a whole different conversation on the differences between public housing and affordable housing, and that whole system as well. But you're not going to have anything change in the schools so long as there are 4,000 unemployed people among the 8,000 folks in some form of public housing or another in our city. But at the same time, we have to be sure that those folks that housing is replaced for one, and the strong support networks in those communities are not absolutely shattered, where folks have replaced what traditionally would have been family relationships with very fragile support relationships there. So, it's I know that's a lot of information, and it's not a lot of legalese, but I'll tell you what, I don't think I've practiced law for 5 or 6 years, even though I'm still technically a lawyer. It's just talking to people and listening to people. So tell me, folks, what do you got? What are your reactions? Have some reactions.
Hey, Mark, thanks so much for taking a moment to share with us. I know we're all pretty bright and smart here, but can you talk a little bit about NIMBYism and the ways that you're seeing that in the city right now?
I'm so glad you asked that question. And actually, I noticed that I made that note because Ross made some great observations that I think there is some code. So we talked a little bit about code switching. There's some great NIMBY codes for I don't want Black people to live in my neighborhood. And it's density, and it's height, it's parking, and it's traffic, and it's pedestrians. And that is what too many people, that's what too many of what kind of people. And it might surprise you, it does not surprise me, but the NIMBY neighborhoods in Powhatan, Virginia, which are Tea Party neighborhoods, use the exact same words that the folks in white parts of Churchill and the North Side and the Fan, which are profoundly capital D Democratic neighborhoods and are supposed to be progressive, that those neighborhoods use in order to defeat public, or not public, but multifamily housing projects, because they believe there's a mythology that any multifamily building, in our era is going to reduce your property values or cause crime. And the neighborhoods in the city have proved that that's just not true, or not true anymore, because those financing systems that some of us talked about, they are gone now. And so multifamily buildings can be beautiful and stable, and folks do choose to live their whole lives and have families in them, and be productive members of society. But if you can go to a meeting and you want to kill something, you ask for a traffic study. You tell it's too dense, it's too tall, it needs finer finishes on the outside. All that stuff, makes it too expensive to build, and then the thing doesn't happen. But those are the code words where you can politely say, I've lived here for a long time, and my kids, grew up here, and kids are going to die if you build that building there. I mean, I've had people say that to me within the last couple of weeks.
You're going to die of what?
If that building is built there.
You build that building there because there'll be cars.
Hey, Mark, can you
NIMBYism? I'm not sure everybody knows.
Not in my backyard. Not in my backyard is what NIMBY means. There's also caves, citizens against virtually everything. It sort of depends on your town as to what they get called. You've got the village people in Midlothian Village. You've got the Libyans at Libyan Grove.
So Mark, on a follow-up on that, what does it mean to work against NIMBYism as a church?
So you're going to have to pay attention to what's going on in your neighborhood, candidly, and it's a neighborhood by neighborhood question, and it's good whenever folks want to whenever you're for something. All right, this is a great test right here. If you are for something, 9 times out of 10, you're on the right track. Because even if your thing that you're all trying to build together is ugly, or some other issue, if you and your neighborhood get together and are neighbors and all get your hands dirty and get something done together, you've done something. But if you're coming out against something, you really need to challenge yourself as to why you're against that. And that's where a lot of the tests that Ross mentioned, I think you have to know all the facts. Who are the folks who are going to be living here? Why am I against that? And you can come up with many valid reasons, like the folks who were worried about the drainage on Brook Road whenever they wanted to put apartments beside Veritas. Lots of folks talking about drainage over there. But any engineer knows that you cannot get your thing built unless you profoundly improve the drainage, which in that case was done. And so you're going to have to really just challenge every little step. And then some of your neighbors too. I'm willing to go out there a little more maybe than others are, and I'm not encouraging you to do that in the same way that I do. But what you can push back on your neighbors a little bit on why they're feeling the way they're feeling, and it's important to remember that for most people, their house is their biggest investment. So especially in these times where folks are getting a little more heated than they have for a minute, folks feel like they're justified in being bad or lying or doing other things that most humans do not feel like are good things whenever their biggest investment, their house, is threatened or perceived to be threatened. So folks think it's okay, of all stripes, of everywhere on the political spectrum. I'm telling you, the Tea Party acts exactly the same way as the Fan District Association.
Mark, one of the things that you said that I really appreciate is you highlighted the importance of needing to actually engage our neighbor. That sounds like a pretty fundamental part of loving our neighbor. So what would you suggest? What would you suggest are some of the ways that we can actually start to, rather than jumping straight to advocating for our neighbor, actually talk to them?
So that's I could only kind of tell you my experience, and I know Blake's probably tired of hearing that, but I you just get physically dirty with neighbors. You got the whole in an urban environment where you have front porches and stuff. Get on your front porch, but the other thing is get out and whenever people see you picking up trash, you wouldn't believe how approachable you've become. whenever I walked out of my house, wearing my suit, like with my war paint on, off to, go to some zoning hearing or get yelled at city council, like ain't nobody going to talk to me when I'm dressed that way. But whenever I'm absolutely filthy from working in the yard and, drinking a cheap light beer on the sidewalk, anybody of any ethnicity and any background will come and stop and talk to you for an hour. I mean, and that's you gotta really go low to go high. I mean, there's any kind of metaphor that we could torture there, but you really just have to be willing to be humble and approachable and social.
I know. Why do I have? He's the pastor of Northside, or at least one of them. Familiar, and the name sounds familiar.
Somebody's talking.
Somebody's not muted.
Yeah, took care of that. Mark, what cheap light beer would you suggest helps facilitate that engagement?
Oh, I think now you probably got to get that bingo lager, right? Aren't we all about local stuff right now?
High Life.
Okay, let's take maybe one more question. Does anyone have one?
Oh no.
Sorry, just like 30 seconds or less. Future of Creighton Court. I mean, is it still getting demolished, and what's happening to people who live there?
Man, I don't think that anybody has any idea, but I can tell you what was supposed to happen. There's been so much change over at the Housing Authority, and they're the folks who are in control of the property, obviously. But let me just give a real quick. I think I'm going to have to go longer than 30 seconds. I'm sorry about that. But the Housing Authority, in almost every other place where public housing existed, has already turned into a regulator and not a landlord. Richmond, because of all kinds of weird things, its housing authority has not been able to sell or convert its properties. So a kind of housing that doesn't exist in New York or New Jersey or Pennsylvania anymore in the way that it exists here still exists here, which was always designed to be sort of the safety net housing. So we have a massive amount of it, and we have a massive amount of migration from those places where folks who formerly lived in public housing there who are coming here to live because this safety net exists. There's a lot of data out there that needs to be collated and accrued to really tell the truth, but it tells such hard truths that nobody's willing to really want to be the one to talk about it in the newspaper. But what that is to say is that because of Richmond's size and because it has such a high burden of public housing, it no longer qualifies for the kinds of federal grants that it would need in order to be able to afford to do the one-for-one level of replacement. Because in order to build a safe neighborhood and a stable neighborhood that isn't the exact same kind of neighborhood with solely poor folks, you have to build 3 units for every one in public housing. So in order to afford to do that, you need massive subsidies, and the government even still provides those through I'm blanking on the name of the program, but just know that it exists. And we don't score. So how the Housing Authority and the city is going to accomplish that without that level of massive subsidy, whenever even the maintenance subsidies are dwindling, can't keep the power on, can't keep the air on. I just don't know that anybody knows the answer to that. So I think that the future is not bright. The future is good with respect to the Churchill North project is doing great. It looks great. It looks good. But Creighton itself and how it's going to get finished and something built in its place is going to require a lot of folks coming to the table. And it's going to have to get past the trendy advocates on Twitter right now believe that public housing needs to stay in place. They believe that those folks should stay there. And if you've never been, I would encourage you to figure out a way to go so you can make that decision for yourself.
Okay. Well, thank you so much, Mark. really appreciate that. And now we're going to pass it off to Eric.
I don't really know why we're passing it off to me. I think we're passing it off to me because Harris and I were talking about this in the office last week, and I was getting fired up about the importance of helping to equip Christians, especially Christians at City Church, for life in the world, as this forum is titled, to bring the kingdom of heaven into Richmond as it is in heaven. And, you know, I think as Ross and Mark and Kathryn have indicated, there's a lot of expertise and experience on this call, and I don't have the experience in the public sphere that many of you have. I don't have the background in the reading or the education or the self-interrogation that Ross talked about that many of you have. But I think it's important that maybe we end by framing this within the context of the Christian faith. And I think that there are ways that as people of faith, we want to think about our work in the world. And the category that I think is most helpful is one of sanctification. And I think this partly because, you know, we just finished this sermon series on virtue, putting on the clothing of Christ. And I think that what we're talking about is how do we do that for the good of our city, and how do we do that in the public sphere? And it's a helpful category because it's a rich category, and it's also one that we often think of in privatized terms. We think of sanctification as something that just happens by ourselves, or kind of me and my Bible. But part of the process of sanctification involves who we are in public and who we are on behalf of our city, and especially the kind of the least of these within our city. And so I just want you to process all that we've heard tonight through the lens of sanctification, of becoming more holy, or other language we use for it is growing up into maturity. That this whole discussion and our concern for the justice of God and our desire to be pointers to his kingdom is rooted in the idea of sanctification. And sanctification is something that involves the whole person, right? It's not just our minds, although our minds will be a big part of it. It's not just our hearts, although our hearts need to be turned back to God to love the things that he loves. And it also involves our hands and our feet. It involves our mouths as we go forth to talk to neighbors or to advocate at neighborhood association meetings or at city council meetings or school board meetings. And I think that we need to, this picture of sanctification moving us to maturity is important too, because sometimes we can have a truncated view of what justice is. But justice is kind of full shalom. It's life the way it's supposed to be. It's relational. It's people being rightly related to one another. So in our city, neighbors to neighbors, whites to black, rich to poor. But it's also the right relationship with God. That is part of the shalom that we're working towards. And there are places where a conversation about justice is happening that understandably necessarily doesn't include that Godward dimension of justice, of flourishing, of wholeness. But for us as Christians, we need to include that as part of what we're working for. So we don't just emphasize justice in public policy, but we want to bear the message of Jesus, the one who is just and the justifier himself. That needs to be part of what we do. So I like to say that we as Christians need to both proclaim and embody the gospel. And some of our embodying of it is the way that we advocate in the city, but it also, part of the work of the church and part of the work of Christians must be proclaiming the message of Jesus. A couple other encouragements about this sanctification process, because if you're anything like me, some of the conversation probably feels overwhelming. You've got long reading lists. You feel like you've been going about it wrong. There are a bunch of issues that you feel ill-informed on, and you don't know where to start. I want to encourage you that that is absolutely okay. Sanctification is a lifelong process of moving towards maturity. And we have to start where we are. And so don't beat yourself up. Don't feel bad. Don't allow people to shame you because you aren't where they are. You may be where they were 5 years ago or a month ago. And allow God to continue to move and the Holy Spirit to grow you wherever you are. This process of sanctification, and this sort of gets at the question that I asked Ross earlier, it's also corporate, it's communal, right? We have each other. It's not a project that you go about alone. And I think this call is a great place to start. You've heard from some other people, you've seen some other faces of people who can help you on this process of sanctification, of growing in virtue. You know, I think we also need to give each other a lot of grace and a lot of space to be at different places along the road. That's very unpopular to say right now, because I think there's a lot of demand for people being where we think they should be in their understanding of justice issues and their process of sanctification. The example that came to mind was a pastor who told the story of some people who visited his church, and they smelled terrible. They smelled like cigarettes. They were kind of dirty, sloppily dressed. And some of the other parishioners at this church pulled the pastor aside afterwards and said, "Do you see these people? Should this sort of people be in our worship service?" And the pastor said, "Well, they just got out of drug rehab and they're trying to get clean from abusing and being addicted to hard drugs. And so I think if they were outside the church smoking cigarettes, we'd call that progress." And I think that is how the process of sanctification works for us. It's okay if you make mistakes. It's okay if you continually find yourself going back through that list of steps that Ross talked about. We need to keep doing that. It's not like we get awareness completely figured out and then we can put that on a shelf and move on to the next step. We have to cycle through this. I think that Ross's steps in a lot of ways mirror the steps of Christian repentance, just without the whole gospel and grace and forgiveness part of it. But it's a helpful pattern that as we grow and are educated, we come to understand more of our sin, and then that can lead us to deeper introspection and repentance over that sin. Here's the final thing I'll say about sanctification and about repentance, that it's really important for it to start at this level of awareness. And most of us are probably at that point of educating ourselves, coming to understand it more deeply. But true repentance always manifests with the fruit of repentance. So I don't think it can just stay there. And I think Ross's caution to step very slowly and cautiously into advocacy, and Mark said the same thing, especially around issues that we're not all that well informed, that is very well taken. But I also know that in our tradition, we are prone to stay at the level of introspection, stay at the level of reading books about stuff, and we need to get into the streets. We need to bring God's justice to the city of Richmond. It can't just be something that we talk about in a sanctuary or in a small group or on a Zoom call. We need to find pathways to do this work. It's going to look different for each of you, right? Ross is passionate about buses and bikes. That's okay. Mark's passionate about NIMBYism. That's okay. Kathryn's passionate about gentrification. That's okay. You may share in one of those passions, or yours may be something else entirely. You might be passionate about the schools, or you might be passionate about food deserts. That is a sign of God's varied grace in each of us. And together, corporately, as the people of God, we advocate for our passions and seek justice. And in so doing that, we will help to bring God's kingdom to Richmond as it is in heaven.
All right, thanks, Eric. So thank you so much for all of this, for your participation. Thanks so much to Ross and Kathryn and Mark and Eric. And I'll just emphasize what everyone else has said. Let this be the entry point. There are a lot of people on this call. So obviously, if you're willing to sit through an hour and a half of a Zoom meeting at night about this, you're willing to talk about it with one another. So seek one of these people out or multiple of these people out and talk about these things. And I thought, given the name of the forum, it would be an appropriate way to end our time is actually to say the Lord's Prayer together. So let me encourage you to have yourself muted, and I'll lead us in it. Let us pray. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom forever, and the glory forever and ever. Amen. Amen. Okay, well, thanks so much, everyone. Great to see you all. Have a good night.
Thanks, everybody.